Even a school child knows that divine omnipotence means God can do anything. But there are some objections to this view. There are some things, it seems, that even God can't do. For instance, have you heard of this brain teaser? If God is so powerful that he can do anything, then he should be able to create a stone so heavy, even he can't lift it. So it seems that if God is all powerful, he must be able to frustrate himself, which got you. It's a catch-22. Is he all powerful or not? If he is, I guess he's not. Well, just break this down and rephrase it differently like this. God is all powerful. That means he can create a stone of infinite weight. But no matter how much the stone weighs, God will always be able to lift it. So you see, the problem just goes away. Or sometimes you may hear, if God's all powerful, shouldn't he be able to sin? And if God cannot sin, then I guess he's not powerful or not all powerful. What this objection misses is that sin is not power. When we sin, it's not a display of force. Sin is actually weakness. Sin is impotence. Sin is lack of power. We sin when we give in, when we can't say no to temptation. So God is so powerful, he cannot sin. He will not sin. That's actually a show of force. Here's, I think, a more interesting objection. If God is all powerful, shouldn't he be able to break the laws of logic? And I'll throw in here math and morality, which I'll explain for in a second. But if God's all powerful, shouldn't he be able to make it the case that Mary is pregnant and Mary is not pregnant? Shouldn't he be able to break the laws of logic? This actually goes back to Plato. He wrote a dialogue called Euthyphro, in which Euthyphro met Socrates in front of the courtyard. So this has to do with morality. I'll explain the story. It'll make sense in a second. So Euthyphro comes to sue his father. He knows his father is guilty and deserving of death because his father bound a slave and threw the slave into a ditch, and the slave died. So he comes to the courthouse, but in the process he meets Socrates, and often in Plato's Socrates, someone is really confident of what they believe. They get into a conversation with Socrates, and he just turns them into a pretzel, and now they don't even know what to think anymore. And that's what happened here. Socrates said to Euthyphro, so you're sure your father is wrong, right? You're sure what he did was immoral. Well, tell me, what makes something immoral? How do you ground morality? Is morality something that the gods say? Do the gods determine what is right or wrong? Or is morality a concept even the gods must oblige? You hear that? We'll say God instead of gods because we believe in just one God, but morality, like don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't take what doesn't belong to you, don't slander. Think of the Ten Commandments. Are these Ten Commandments, or this moral code, is this something that God came up with, that God determined it? Or is this a moral code that even God has to meet, some standard he must oblige? This actually goes to a long-standing philosophical dispute between the realists on one side and the nominalist on the other. A philosophical realist is someone who believes these universal categories like logic, math, morality, beauty, goodness, truth, justice, these things are actually real. They really exist. There is such a thing as justice that all of us must oblige. There is such a standard of beauty that if something meets that standard, it is beautiful. If it doesn't meet that standard, it is not beautiful. A philosophical realist, in the history of the Western philosophy, most people were realists. Plato, Aristotle, in the Christian tradition, Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas. Most of the long tradition was philosophical realism, which said there is such a standard that exists outside of us in our minds, justice, truth, beauty, and we all must meet that. So that God is not just free to change the standard. There is a standard that all of us must meet. The other challenger to that occurred in the late Middle Ages It's called late medieval nominalism. And this is the view popularized by William of Ockham. Maybe you've heard of Occam's razor. Jodie Foster quoted it in the movie Contact. Essences must not be multiplied beyond necessity. It means take the simplest route always. So what we have are not these abstract ideals like beauty, justice, goodness, truth. What we have are particular things. We have this particular act in this particular face. And beauty is just something we use to describe what this face has in common with that face. And justice is just a word we use to describe what this act has in common with that act. Or to make a real pedestrian example, you have a realist would say there's such a thing as treeness. And when we see a maple or an elm or an oak, we say, oh, those are trees because they approximate this ideal of treeness. A nominalist would say, what is treeness? Treeness is just a word. In fact, the word nomen, N-O-M-E-N, the word nomen means names. So these universals like treeness, they're just names that our minds use to think with. We see a maple, we see an oak, we see an elm. What do these have in common? Well, they're not bushes, and they're not clouds, and they're not a lot of other things that they're not, but they're trees. But there's no such thing as treeness apart from the actual particular thing. Same thing with justice or beauty or truth. These things don't exist on their own apart from actual particular things. So nominalists would say only the particulars are real, whereas realists would say these universals that transcend the particulars, they are what's most real. So here's how this applies to our categories. If realism is true, then there is logic and math and morality. These things are standards that are universal, and even God must meet them. So when we say God is good, goodness really is a thing. It really is a standard that even God must meet in order to say that he is good. If you're a nominalist, you would say, well, no, what is goodness? All that exists is particulars. There are no universal categories that God has to oblige. So goodness, it's whatever God says it is. If God says being faithful to your spouse is good, well, then that's good. If God says committing adultery is good, well, then that would be good. If God says murder is good, well, that would be good. If God says preserving life is good, well, then that would be good in this case. So goodness is whatever God says. So just what Euthyphro, what Plato asked, what Socrates asked Euthyphro, is goodness whatever the gods say? That would be nominalism. Or is goodness a standard even God must oblige? I skipped over math. Let me just say a word about math. Math, 2 plus 2 is 4 in the base 10 system, right? We can't imagine that not being the case. In any possible world, our minds can only conceive of 2 apples and 2 apples being 4 apples. It's nonsense to think 2 apples and 2 apples is 5 apples. That we just can't ever believe that. So it seems like the rules of math and the rules of logic and the rules of morality, it seems like these are things that even God has to meet. That God's not just able to make them up. But here's the thing. If God can't make them up, if God can't change them, well, then how is he powerful? Right? If logic, math, and morality are these universal standards even God has to oblige, even God has to meet, then how is he powerful? How is he in charge? How is he sovereign? But on the other hand, if God's free to change them, if God could change the laws of logic and change what math is and change morality, well then, what do these things even mean? Like, when we say God is good, if goodness is a standard even God has to meet to be called good, well then is he powerful? But if goodness is whatever God says, what does goodness even mean? So you feel this dilemma? Either we seem to be limiting God's power, or end up with a God whose will is just rampant, and he can just do whatever he blame wants, and he might not even be good. The answer to this is what we'll talk about yet yet this week. The way to get off this dilemma is with divine simplicity. Because if God is simple, then God doesn't just have universal categories like goodness and truth and beauty and justice. If God has no parts, if God is just one simple being, then God doesn't just possess or have these perfections, God is them. And if God is them, then when we say God has to meet them as a standard, he really does. But the standard he has to meet is not something outside of himself, it is himself. So when God meets the standard of goodness and truth and beauty and justice, it's a harmless form of self-dependence. We're just saying that God must be faithful to who he is. He is not free to change who he is. He's a good God. He's sovereign and powerful, and he also really is good. So simplicity, this is one of the most compelling reasons why the tradition has always said God is simple, because it explains how saying God is good is actually a meaningful statement, and yet God is not trying to meet some standard outside of himself or above himself. God just is these things. One other quick objection, which not too terrifying, but if God's omnipotent, shouldn't he be able to change the past? Like Superman reversing the rotation of the earth to save Lois Lane. This doesn't work, though, because if God did change the past, then you would have a contradiction. There is a history in which Lois Lane is dead, and there is a history in which Lois Lane did not die. But that would be a contradiction, right? Which would it be? And as we just said, God cannot break the laws of logic, not because logic is stronger than him, but because logic is him. And by the way, I think this is pretty cool. When we study physics or geology or biology, when we study the sciences, we are studying the products of God's will. We are studying the world that God chose to create. We can certainly imagine a world in which many of these laws of physics and biology and the rocks are different, right? God could have made different creatures than humans and said, you are in my image. Maybe we could have 5 eyes or no eyes, right? You can imagine a human read science fiction books or watch science fiction Star Trek, and people create ideas of creatures that are somewhat different than us, but always working with what we see in our world. But we can imagine a world that's physically, scientifically very different than ours. So science studies the products of God's will. But logic and math and morality, if God's not free to change these things, then these things are not products of God's will, what God has chosen to do. These things are God's very nature. God is logic. God is math. God is righteousness and justice, morality. So when we study math, we're not just studying what God has chosen. We're studying something deeper in. We're studying the very nature of God. Finally, omnipotence, I think we can easily meet these challenges, but omnipotence is still famously hard to define. Philosophers have struggled to have a very exact, precise definition that avoids all exceptions, and it's even the great Alvin Plantinga just gave up and said it cannot be done. But Eleanor Stump has a nice rough definition in one of her treatises, and I think this more or less works. She only used the word logic. I insert morally because I think God also will not, cannot sin. But in a nutshell, here's a rough definition of omnipotence. If something is logically and morally necessary, then God must do it. If something is logically and morally impossible, God cannot do it. For everything else, God's free to do it. That last part is essential, by the way. If you leave out that last part, you haven't defined omnipotence, right? You have to say what God is able to do. So if something is logically and morally required, God has to do it. If it's logically impossible or immoral, well, then God cannot, he will not do it. But everything else, he's free to do. So that's more or less, in most situations that we will experience, that definition works. God is able to do whatever he wants to do as long as it does not violate his own nature.